Hello everyone and welcome to the Kubernetes 122 video release notes. Now, for all of you who are new to these, just my quick few friendly reminders before we jump into the meat of this video. First, if you are new to Kubernetes releases, I just made a video called Understanding Kubernetes Releases that goes over everything from deprecation cycles to the differences between alpha, beta, and GA to SIGs and a bunch of other terminology like how they even version the project. So if that sounds like you, if you're new to the project, if you're new to Kubernetes release notes and want to understand these release notes just a little bit better, I encourage you to go ahead, check that video out. I'll put a link to it right here. And go ahead and check it out and understand these a little bit better, because I don't actually make these videos necessarily beginner friendly, as well as I didn't want to make that same information repeated on every single one of these videos. So I'm going to link it. Go check it out if that's you. So let's move on to my second point. As usual, these are just what I found to be most interesting. While I try to hit everything that is important in the general case, depending on what you're doing, there might be something I miss as the Kubernetes release hundreds of changes and over 50 new features in these releases, making it almost impossible to cover everything in a sane amount of time. So I try to pull out what is going to be the most important to the 95% case. So I still encourage you to all check out the link below to the release notes yourself and to review them yourself. They make a good read, especially if you're having trouble sleeping. And the very last thing I want to talk about is just, if there is something that you find, if you read the release notes and you find something that is very interesting to you and you think it would be very helpful to other people, please leave a comment. I'll pin that. I'll make sure that people can see it. I love also hearing what you're interested in. So even if it's not important, but just interesting, please go ahead and let me know. So let's talk about Kubernetes 122. It is one of the largest, it's one of the top 2 Kubernetes releases this year. Okay, that was a joke. It's the second release of this year, so it kind of has to be one of the top 2. Let's start out with what I really like to usually start out it with is deprecations and removals, because these are the most important to you guys as they're going to actually affect your current state. First, there's a whole slew of beta APIs that are getting removed. I'm going to bring up some of them. I think I got most of them, but you can go ahead. There's actually a web page for this, and you can go check that out yourself. Now, don't start panicking. This isn't a big deal. The GA versions of these were not removed. This is just removing the beta versions. This is a very natural progression. Once the GA versions were released, each of the beta versions were deprecated. And so now in version 122, these will be removed. This means there is no way to use them. No flag or feature gate is going to work to bring them back from the grave. Their code is getting removed. They are done, dusted. They are X features and X versions. Move to the stable releases. That's, I guess, what my recommendation is. Move to the stable releases. They're the stable ones. All right. So which ones are these? They are ingress, custom resource definition, validating webhook configuration, mutating webhook communication configuration, and certificate signing requests. Now, again, I really suggest that you check out the deprecation API mitigation guide at the link below. They have tons of useful information on each one of these and how to migrate from any one of them, from any one of the betas to the now stable releases. And it can be super useful. So if you're using any one of these betas and you're starting to panic, don't. Everything's going to be okay. This isn't a big deal. Go ahead and check out their migrations. Now, there is a kubectl convert plugin that you can also use, though I'm not actually ever done this myself, so I can't actually recommend it, and I can't tell you that it actually works. I'm not saying it doesn't work. I just don't know. So if that seems interesting to you, it converts your manifest files for you. It looks interesting, looks cool, just never used it myself. And so I'm giving it there for your information, but not as a recommendation that I used it and that it works. I'm sure it works though. All right, so let's talk about the one big deprecation that I saw. The one big deprecation of this cycle was the dynamic kubelet configuration. Now, after being in beta since I think it was Kubernetes 1.12, maybe 1.11, the Kubernetes team has decided to deprecate the dynamic kubelet config instead of continuing on in its deployment. This is kind of the same thing that happened with pod security policies. It stayed in beta for too long. Now, that being said, I was much more intimate with the issues revolving around pod security policies and why that implementation just had problems and it was going to be hard to fix it in place. To be honest, I'm not sure why this is going away, other than it was either kind of poorly documented because it never seemed to work correctly. But I'm not sure if that was because it was not working or if it was because it was poorly documented. I don't know, because none of us knew how to use it. So anyways, chicken and egg thing there. That being said, I am a little sad as the dynamic kubelet config I found interesting, and I admit that it was on my plans to actually investigate more. It seemed a little bit dangerous flying by the seat of your pants as you would dynamically reload the configuration in Kubernetes, but at the same time, it seemed pretty cool and that it could be useful in the future. So it's going away. As far as plans for anything that like it, I don't know that there's anything in the works. So this has basically been split into three different categories. The first one is deprecations and removals. The second one is what I'm looking forward to the most, what I think is most exciting, what is most exciting. And then everything else that we're just going to cover quickly and hopefully very quickly. So the very first one that I'm super excited about is server-side apply. Server-side apply basically removes the functionality that kubectl apply does and puts it into the server. This allows you to have the same functionality kubectl has without needing to depend on kubectl to do it, because kubectl was never meant to be used in another project. If you try to import kubectl and use it, it is a pain and was never designed to be used like that. And so this is actually really useful and actually really helpful if you're doing anything related to the Kubernetes API. This is really huge and I'm absolutely excited about it. It's one of the biggest things I have been looking forward to. Now, as we talked about last time, pod security policy, there is a new replacement for it. It's not called Project Phoenix like I had called out, but there is now a new pod security emission controller. And this is what's going to, in the end, replace pod security policies as long as it doesn't suffer the same fate. But it's the same people around it, so I'm sure that they have taken the good lessons from last time and applied them to this. This new emission controller is going to be able to enforce pod security standards by namespace. The enforcement can be done at 3 different levels. It's actually quite interesting how they've done it, and I'm actually really excited to start playing around with it. So the 3 different levels are enforce, and of course, enforce is going to cause policy violations will be rejected. And then there's audit, where policy violations will trigger the audit annotation, but otherwise they will be allowed. And then warn is obviously policy violations will trigger a warning, but are otherwise allowed. This actually has huge implications of how it can be implemented differently in QA and production and testing and dev, and where you might want different functionality based off where it is. And it's really cool. And it's going to be also possible to configure this via the admission configuration file. And I think this is pretty nifty, and I'm looking forward to testing it out in the very near future. I can assure you that if I get the time and I do try out anything with the emission controller, I will make a video on it. I'm still needing to make my dual stack video from last release. I don't know where the time went. Maybe I will, one of these days here soon, maybe I'll have a testing Kubernetes features weekend, and I'll just bust out a bunch of these and then release some of the videos on them after that. Or that might actually not make a really horrible live stream, to just have 4 hours to test Kubernetes features after a release. Maybe we could do that as like the Saturday after, as kind of like a routine. Not sure. That's not happening in this release though, so don't get your hopes up that this Saturday. All right, so let's move on to the next thing, and that would be rootless mode containers is graduating to alpha. It goes with the lines, if you don't need it, don't give it to it. So with this particular enhancement, Kubernetes is taking this zero trust, this non-root, one step further by letting you run your entire Kubernetes stack as non-root user, meaning that all parts of it, even the control plane, can run as non-root. This way, the big deal here is if your Kubernetes cluster is compromised, if one of the Kubernetes control plane components is compromised, they're not going to be able to access your underlying infrastructure. This is really awesome. Now, you can run Kubernetes in rootless mode by some really hard manual steps, but if you're installing a new cluster, kubeadm is making it simpler, and again, is one of the things I would like to make a video on if I get the time to. And we'll talk about kubeadm a little bit later in these notes. Cgroups is a Linux kernel feature, and again, is the backbone of our modern containers as they are, allowing you to limit the resources usage of CPUs and memory and disk and I/O and network I/O of a process. And its version 2 API was declared stable like a year and a half ago, and most Linux distributions are already using it by default. If you look, I have a video on Cgroups v2 and some of the reasons that it was created in the first place, why version 1 had some issues and what they were. And actually, if you look in the comments, I had some awesome feedback from one of the actual maintainers who let me know that there were even more reasons than that, which was in my video, that the V2 was needed. And that was really cool that he commented on one of my videos. Anyhow, this is the initial work to make Kubernetes itself work with Cgroups v2, which is really important because Cgroups v2 is going to bring a lot more features. Now, because I say this is the initial work, this is all around the configuration. All of the different features and different things you're going to be able to do with Cgroups v2 isn't part of this. It's just the very initial work to be done. Another thing is that this does not state anything about the deprecation of v1. v1 is still in scope, and if I had to guess, v1 won't even be deprecated until after v2 becomes fully stable. This means that you're going to have at least a full year of v1 support until until v1 is deprecated, meaning you're going to have at least 2 years of v1 support from today, because there's no way that v2 will go into stable for at least another year. This feature is not about bringing any of the features from v2. There is another cap out there for some memory limits, but that one is talked about in a little bit. Node swap support, something none of us thought would ever finally make it into Kubernetes. So this is graduating to alpha, again, which means it's not easy to use at this point. But swap, if you don't know what it is basically memory in disk. So if you run out of memory, you can use your disk as memory, which is slow, even on SSDs compared to RAM. Anyhow, there are things out there that are heavily memory constrained, like Node applications or probably Java or Python, any of the bad languages, basically. That was a joke. Not a joke. Anyways, this enhancement basically enables Kubernetes workloads to use swap. Now, it was a little weird. This is global for the entire node and isn't configured per workload. It's configured per node. So if you'd like to have a video on how to use this and what it means, let me know. I'd be interested in checking it out myself. Seccomp by default is a feature coming to a Kubernetes cluster near you. Now, I can't say it enough. I know I have talked about the seccomp operator, which I think is now called the security operator. A couple of my friends worked on it, some people that I really respect and are fantastic engineers. And it's a feature to enable this by default. And why this is such a big deal is because it's going to help you prevent CVEs and zero-day vulnerabilities by doing nothing. With things like this on, you can stop these before they're even a problem, and that's fantastic. Don't make me slice up another onion and talk about the layers of security. This is what it's all about. Every single time I talk about one of these things, they don't solve the big picture. They solve a single layer. All of them you can get around if you want a single one, but you add the layers and you make it harder, if not impossible. Okay, so those are all of the features that I was really excited about and that I think have the biggest impact to you all. Now, I'm going to spend a little less time on the rest of these to try to keep this video to a manageable length. Not only that, but there could be other things that I removed that just did not make it into this list. And so I'm sorry if that's you and you were expecting one of those features. So check out the release notes yourself and see if there's something specific you are looking for. If there is, you definitely want to check out the release notes because they're going to have all of the information. If you do find something that you find important that was not covered here, please leave me a comment. All right, so the first one here is job tracking without lingering pods is graduating to alpha. Basically, it used to be that jobs were not able to remove completed pods until all of them had completed, and now that's not true. Jobs are going to be able to track and complete them and remove completed pods earlier, freeing up your resources in your cluster. The next one is the add a min ready seconds to stateful set. This is actually something that has been available on deployments, daemon sets, replica sets. I'm probably missing something, but other things. And basically, this is bringing that exact same functionality that you expect there to stateful sets. So basically, if declared, a newly created pod won't be considered available until their container stays ready, or containers if it's multi-container pod. Don't do multi-container pod. Anyways, it's only going to be considered available once their containers have stayed ready without crashing for the specified number of seconds. So this, you can just give yourself a small buffer. Cron jobs are graduating to stable. I didn't actually realize. I didn't realize they were in beta. So I brought this up because I didn't even know it. Moving on then. There's not much else to say about it. Nothing big changed. Cron jobs are just graduating to stable. All right, so daemon set max surge is graduating to beta. If you don't want to know what this is, basically when performing a rolling update, it allows you to do a max surge. So instead of deleting one pod and then adding a new pod, you can have a surge, so it can create 3 pods. You know, if your max surge was 3 pods, you'd be able to it would be able to create 3 new pods first. So basically, you're 3 pods over the total number of pods that you want. And this can be updated in the spec strategy rolling update max surge field. And this is going to give your controller what the maximum number of pods over the desired number of pods that can be created when doing an update. So the default value, if you don't give it one, is going to match the previous behavior, which is 25%. The next things are 2 things that we talked about in last one. in the last Kubernetes release, which is logarithmic scale down, as well as pod deletion cost. Both of these are revolving around how you scale down your Kubernetes cluster, something that hasn't had great support. Both of these are graduating to beta and are becoming much easier to use. So both of these allow you, the logarithmic is basically a way to randomly remove a pod, and the other one is based off of cost and is going to allow you to delete the highest cost nodes first. The next one is the service load balancer class, and this is graduating to beta. This is, again, something that we talked about in the last Kubernetes release, and this enhancement is going to allow you to leverage multiple load balancers in a single cluster. And again, watch my last Kubernetes release notes if you're wanting to know why this is interesting and what problems it solves. I go into more depth there. So there's actually a cgroups v2 feature coming to alpha, and that is memory quality of service. Now that cgroups v2 is coming into support, there's new features around cgroups v2 that can be brought in, and quality of service of memory is one of them. It has a bunch of different options, from the minimum amount of memory, the maximum amount of memory, memory low and memory high, and it gives you these to allow you better and more accurate control over the memory of your pod. So definitely super cool, and it should help make your Kubernetes clusters more memory efficient. All right, so there's a new CPU manager policies, and these are graduating to alpha. Basically, graduating to alpha means they're brand new. This is basically allows the CPU manager to assign exclusive workloads to specific CPU cores. This will allow you to isolate the workload per CPU core. Basically, what it's trying to do is avoid context switching and cache switching. And if you actually go back and watch my last release notes, we talked about NUMA buses and how NUMA buses could, when you're talking about low latency, really hurt them. Now, this is mostly for really low latency workloads. And so if you're not a really low latency workload, this is probably not that important to you. But this is where it's really going to really help. All right, so the next thing is huge page storage medium size is graduating to stable. This is a feature that was released in Kubernetes 1.19. I should put, yes, 1.19. Anyways, and it's now graduating to stable, and basically it's just bringing the features that was first introduced to huge pages as a stable feature. Another one that I have talked about in my Kubernetes 1.19 release note was ephemeral containers, and these are graduating to beta. I'm super excited about ephemeral containers because they're a great way to debug running pods. And now that it's in beta, you're going to be able to do this without feature flags, which is huge. And it's actually really awesome. So you can use these features by using kubectl debug and add an ephemeral container to a pod after creation. So all of you, I'm quite sure, are aware that you can't add a pod to a pod. You can't add a container to a pod after creation, but that's where these ephemeral containers come in for debugging. You can learn more about that in some of my past videos. Then there is the component config for the scheduler API. This is graduating to beta and is pretty cool. Component config is an effort that's been going on for quite a while to make configuration much more dynamic and reachable through the Kubernetes API. Of interesting note, I actually have a few of the very first PRs in this work. Sadly, my life took me away from this, working on this. But the other people that are working on this are fantastic and awesome and deserve a huge hand and huge shout out, because it's really making Kubernetes a better place for everyone and has been a ton of work. All right, so namespace selectors. I talked about this in last release, is graduating to beta, and this is where you can select namespaces like you do pods using labels. Pretty cool. There is a new RWO access mode graduating to alpha. So in this enhancement, it's possible to access persistent volumes in a read-write-once pod mode. This restricts access to a single pod on a single node. The already existing read-write-once access mode restricts access to a single node, but allows a lot of simultaneous access from many pods on that node. You could also solve that with a daemon set that accesses it, but that makes you change your app, not your deployment. So it's pretty cool. You should check it out. The next thing is storage populators. Talking about storage, I saw that it looks like storage populators are getting a redesign, and there's an interesting blog article in the works. I think it will be released by the time this video hits on the changes being made, and I did a code review on it. I think that while storage populators are still in alpha, if you're using it or interested in using it, you should check out the link, as the blog post is really an interesting read, as it goes over to why some of the changes are needed to be made. So go ahead and check that out. There are Windows privileged containers now graduating to alpha. This basically brings privileged containers that have been available in Linux to the Windows host. If you don't know what a privileged container is, it has access to the host as if it was running directly on the host and not inside of a container. These are not recommended for workloads, but they are useful for administration and monitoring and some security stuff as well. Now, I can't tell you how useful this might be for Windows. To be honest, I don't understand Windows containers. I probably need to investigate Windows containers more because I don't even know what a Windows container is. I mean, containers is a Linux kernel feature. I'm guessing they added this to the Windows kernel, but I don't really know. And so maybe I need to investigate that more so I can cover this type of topic a little bit better. But while we're talking about Windows, they did add support for the CSI plugins in Windows. So that's graduating to stable. So the container storage interface plugins let third-party storage solutions into Kubernetes, and Windows is now able to use the CSI plugins, and it's now stable. So I don't know. Windows containers for the win. All right, so moving on to API server tracing. This is probably should have been at the top. Actually, when this goes to beta, it will be at the top. It will be really cool. As it is right now, not so much. So basically what this enhancement is doing is improves the API server to allow tracing requests by the open telemetry libraries. And this is huge. This is going to allow you to use open telemetry with your Kubernetes cluster, not just your workloads in the cluster, but your cluster themselves. This is really cool. Moving on, the ingress class namespace parameters is moving to beta. If you didn't know what these were, I didn't either until just a few days ago. After the initial release of the ingress class, there was a number of use cases calling for the ability to reference namespace scoped parameters. The kubeadm project has added the ability to run the control plane as non-root in kubeadm. And this is, again, an alpha feature and is related to the previous comment about rootless mode for the control plane. So as kubeadm is the default upstream installer for the Kubernetes project, it is their implementation of the other work that we talked about of rootless containers as the kubeadm or the Kubernetes control plane. This is really cool, and we really will have to do a video at least on this. The kubeadm configuration is graduating to beta. So over the lifespan of kubeadm, there's basically been two ways to configure your cluster. One was through command line arguments, while the other was through this kubeadm config file. Now, they really stopped supporting the CLI command line flags and have really been pushing the config file. And the config file has really been the only way to create certain very special cluster configurations. Like I talked about previously, you had to use this if you wanted to change to systemd provider for your containers. The goal of this feature is basically to redesign how the config is persisted. Basically, currently it's a very flat file and it's basically just a brain dump of the options. And they're bringing a structured support to the configuration file to make it a little bit simpler to persist and use that file. Along these lines, I also noticed that the kubeadm deprecated the v1 beta 1 as well as released a new v1 beta 3 API. Now, the v1 beta 2 has not been deprecated, but I'm sure it will be in the future since v1 beta 3 has been released. All right, everyone, that was all of the Kubernetes 122 release notes that I found interesting. If you found something else interesting, please let me know in the comments below. I hope that you found this helpful, informative, and has made your day just a little bit better. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Support me in making these videos and bringing you guys this. If you did not like this video, I'm going to have to ask you, please go ahead, subscribe, stick around, and see if these videos get any better for science.